Uh, so I welcome you all to the session, Time Synchronization, why it matters for you and your and national cybersecurity design and operations. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel right now. So it's Mr. Dilip Panjwani. He's the Global Head Cybersecurity Practice and CEO of LT Mindtree. Mr. Prakash Padaria, he's the Senior VP and Global CISO of Oyo Rooms. And Mr. Faisal Mufti, he's VP Global Information Security, Cyber Defense and Security Intelligence Leader of Genpact. Now I would like to hand over the mic to our moderator, Mr. Atul Kumar. He's the lead government initiative of DSCI. Up to you, Atul. Thank you.
So thanks Ankit, and thank you everyone for joining just after the lunch and being so quick to join. A lot of people are expected to join. Hopefully they'll join in some time. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this session. So you have heard the topic. Now I'll quickly start with a question actually. So how many of you know who is the inventor or conceptualization, the one who has conceptualized this NTP server? Do you know the name? Okay. So the thing is, billions of devices are now today leveraging this NTP server to synchronize the time, and the guy behind this was David Mills, and he has done it long back. It was late 70s when he started working on that. It was a kind of a fun project for him actually. So when he started doing it, it was more of a for power grid, and they were so we used to see a lot of gap in terms of time synchronization in a clock synchronization in the power grid, and that varies with the temperature, that varies with the type of the power plants that they have. If it is a hydro based, it is different. If it is a coal based, it's different. So it started from there actually, and later on a lot of things, as you know, started from ARPANET. This also became a project in ARPANET, and he's the guy who worked on that and created a time synchronization protocol, a procedure, which now we call it NTP, uh, as a uh, protocol to synchronize the time across the network, across the devices. So that was the sort of story behind it actually. But here, couple of things, and in last couple of months of time, it became quite a discussion point because of the third direction that came in under 70B, where CERT has asked to all the organizations, technically speaking, all the body corporates here in India or whosoever is doing some business here in India, to synchronize all the ICT system clocks with the NTP servers of either NIC or NPL. Later on, they have given a relaxation that it can be any UTC server which is traceable to NIC or NPL. That happened, and that became a very major discussion point, and gained the traction in the ecosystem. And that was one of the reasons why we have conceptualized this session and understand why it became a point there, and how it is relevant from the national perspective for the organization. And we have a eminent panel here to discuss that. All of you, many of you would have already interacted with them. So what I'll do, I'll quickly start with quick remarks from everyone, and then we'll move ahead in the discussion actually. We'll keep double clicking all the aspects around that. So let's start with Dilip
Thanks,
around
Atul.
the national perspective and overall importance of this topic, the time synchronization and NTP server.
So, Atul, I think giving the importance of why this topic is already established by Samir in his opening remarks today when he kicked off in the morning, where I think the themes that were being discussed out as what has been set up as the context for DSCI AISS 2022 conference had one of this topic called out very clearly in the governance risk compliance. Now, why does this really have so much importance in today's life is everything today is interconnected. Now, when everything is interconnected, the amount of risk for cyber attacks and vulnerabilities exploitation is going on increasing. This qualifies now for the onus that is attached to the organizations or to the service providers who are giving these services to ensure that they have the right set of time synced assets and devices so that they can correlate threat events and identify a real attack which could be possibly targeted or could be spread out, and uh, having a timeline which really needs to be mapped in order to arrive at the final attack pattern which is really attached to it. So keeping that in mind, from an organization perspective is one aspect. Similarly, when there are multiple organizations who are reporting back to CERT as per the CERT guidelines, and where CERT is going to be collating this information and then trying to find some patterns. Is it only for a certain sector, a certain type of organization, or a certain geography within the country? And for that, again, they would require these time synchronization aspects to understand whether it is happening in a certain period of time or is it just random events which are happening. And hence, it does qualify that we need to have dedicated understanding and clear focus on what we're trying to achieve, which time synchronization is going to help us in.
Sure, thanks. And probably we'll double click this aspect in again. We'll come back to you and double click all these aspects. So, Prakash, your views on that larger perspective, why it's important?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'll have a different perspective here. If you are from a hardware field, right? There used to be day people used to assemble the systems, computers. And if you know a bit of a hardware, there is a round cell in a motherboard which manages the time when there is no power supply or your system is shut down. So whenever you start your system, your time is always there, right? Now, once you stack the server in a rack, you might have 1,000 servers in your data center. How many of you will pull out the servers and change the batteries? No one, right? Who will open the server, find the motherboard, remove that round cell and put one new Maxell cell? People don't do it. That's where NTP comes in the picture, because it always syncs the time. And like Dilip highlighted, it's super critical to maintain it, because you might have 1,000 computers across geographies. And whenever a recon has to be done, when an IR or a forensic has to be done, it is super critical there to ensure that the time syncs are maintained everywhere to correlate the events. It's very, very useful when you do the IR or the forensics, right? So just 2 points.
Okay, sure. Fazul, your views?
Thank you, Atul, and good afternoon, everyone. We've already understood the benefits and requirements of why NTP is needed. I'll just touch upon a couple of additional factors. Today, we've seen there's a lot of threat landscape which touches every aspects of the inventory we have in the organizations, right? So what is important is where we have the same time offset available across these inventories to make sure that the correlation is relevant and goes back in time. It's very important to make sure that today, when we are talking about security incidents and investigations, the chain of custody, maintaining those time available events across the historical events is critical. And we understand the importance there. If there is a off-sync of time between these different inventories in the organization, and we're just talking about organization as one entity, and when we scale it out to the national aspect, it actually creates a lot of disintegration between, when we are correlating incidents and maintaining the identification of what went wrong and how those events transpired. So we need to understand, I think, making that, this is a basic concept eventually, right? But unfortunately, the difficulties around how we deploy it is much more difficult today, and we'll discuss about it. For an importance perspective, it's very important to understand that making synergies is relevant and critical, not only for the organization internally, but also for the overall national space.
Sure, thanks a lot for this. Actually, picking up from what common thread all of you have picked up, right? It's like for overall threat intelligence and correlation of logs and building that insights on what's happening, it's very important to have that common time clock across the infrastructure. Now, there are two scenarios. First, we are dealing with such a wide range of infrastructure, right? And we are dealing with the infrastructure not just spreading in a specific geography, but across the geography as well. If we go back to it's like 2014 or 2017, couple of attacks have also happened leveraging NTP. Actually, if you read it out, the DDoS attacks or amplification attacks that used to happen. After that, lot of changes happen in NTP protocols itself to avoid that, and people are taking care of that aspect, restricting certain ports, restricting certain sort of commands, and because of that, we are avoiding those risks. But it is not across, right? So, from cyber defense perspective, from the attack which can be leveraged NTP server, what's your view? So I'll start with you, Faisal, if you can.
Yeah, very important aspect of NTP or making a hygiene which is critical in the infrastructure. For an organization, when we are doing the building of the security layers, it's important that we understand that NTP becomes critical in that nature, right? But the focus for an organization has never been into NTP. Practically, I've seen a lot of organizations, how we have started deploying infrastructure and making sure that infrastructure is aligned to the hygiene controls. But we always had NTP the least priority for not only for IT, but for information security requirements as well. And that's where the loophole has come in. Within the organization, there was no central time sync server which was available. That's number one point. Then people started, the organization-wide requirements started to grow. So we started to find out what's the public source for our NTP, source, right? And making sure that sync happened, we started opening up the floodgates. We started opening up that public communication in from sources inside to our organizations without understanding the architecture appropriately, which created those different attack scenarios that Atul highlighted. So what is important is making sure that we understand the architecture layout appropriately, making controls relevant to how time synchronization from that source, which could be internal or public, we define the controls around it. Maybe make sure that your specific communication ports are allowed. Do not allow any other communication from public networks or public sources to internal networks directly. Create a hop in between, which is your time sourcing, and then let other systems inside your network talk to that single source which is facing internet, right? So I think that I would just suggest that. And one last piece is, we have been focusing around talking today about how relevant it is to security incidents. The importance here is that we make sure that the identification of your multi-geo, multi-environment systems is also relevant, right? You make sure that your environment could be geographically distributed. So how you connect all of your NTP sources, making sure your time sync is important, is critical.
Sure, thanks for that. Actually, if you see the importance of NTP server itself or time synchronization, so one of the excellent use cases is GPS, which we are regularly using, right? And any incident on or connected with NTP or time synchronization can hamper a lot of things. So in case of GPS, if you see how it's happening when your NTP or time synchronization protocol is talking to satellite system and mixing and matching those information and giving you the correct information in terms of your GPS. Any minor changes and minor incident over there can hamper that thing. And now GPS kind of technology, I'm just taking one use case. This is a kind of a technology which is sort of being part of so many deliveries, right, which are critical. These are part of various critical infrastructure as well. So any small ramification can have a very large ramification from that perspective. So another thing, thanks for this, Faisal. I'll add one more aspect here as Prakash was talking about it. Say, you have a lot of isolated systems and OT, IoT kind of things. Now this time synchronization becomes very difficult in that sense. So again, both the perspective, leveraging NTP server, how we can have those kind of attacks and how can we restrict us, avoid that thing, and also why it is so critical for cyber defense in the organization. So if you can share some thoughts on that. Prakash, yeah.
Sure. One of the very important point what Faisal highlighted is most of us have infras across cloud, right? There is a consolidation happening at most of the places, but still, if I talk about my cases, we are present on all the clouds, and we are present in 35 countries. Now what happens is, if we don't have a proper sync enabled, whenever we have to do the forensic, it becomes too difficult. Especially for India, I need to have a IST time zone. For my Europe server, it has to be that time zone. Obviously, the regulators in those countries have a different requirement of syncing to those particular servers. And every cloud with close to 5,000 servers around, it becomes too difficult. The next generation technology, uh, Kubernetes, the clusters, the Dockers, when we make the golden images of the server, this is the time what Faisal was highlighting it. If you build 1,000 servers and then do NTP sync on top of that, it becomes too difficult. Rather just have this NTP protocols, everything, that which server to talk to, how often to sync to. If it's all in the golden image or in the clusters itself, it becomes super easy. The last point, which is very important, I was fortunate to work in those space, which is IoT. Now, typical IoTs don't even run on Windows 10. These are embedded operating systems. These are probably age old. You might still see Windows XP running in a power plant. How do you sync them? How do you talk to a NTP server? Typically nothing but a UDP protocol. Somebody does a UDP flood, like Fazul highlighted, takes it down. Simple. So do you open those ports, those protocols from the firewall or not? And spatially ensuring these IoT security devices are synced. It is super critical, because then the whole forensic on IoT is totally a different game than doing on a cluster infra of probably Windows server or Linux server. So just 2 points.
Sure, thanks for that. Dilip, your views on that. Actually, you also deal with varied infrastructure across the geography, different sort of stakeholders, and this is emerging like a major element there. So again, your views from both the perspective. And if you want to add any other aspect into that.
Sure, Atul. So I think Faisal as well as Prakash already covered pretty much most of the aspects on the infra side. I'll not touch upon those again. But when you look at it from the perspective of cloud, for example, today how many of our organizations are really looking at the cloud application that you've taken? Have you gone and configured the time zone requirements over there? Have you set it up to a certain time zone as per your organization settings, or have you left it default? It's just like the typical S3 bucket which we leave on standard configurations. How many of us have actually gone and configured our IoT system, like our access controls and our CCTV cameras, onto some centralized time sync server? And are we looking at they are also in the same time sync as your other IT systems which are running on your SIM? Because tomorrow, if there is a breach that is found and you want to correlate it to a physical breach also, for example, how will you get those logs synchronized even if they're not talking to the SIM? You would have to manually extract logs and then match them out. Let's take example of, okay, now you've done all the 9 years, you've got the configurations done. Most of our SaaS applications today, let's say security application like the EDRs of the world today, when you configure them, you can set up the configuration that they will possibly do a UTC configuration for time sync. Cool, that's done. Nice. Now your domain server is set up on your India time zone because you're a India data center. Your EDR solution is as per UTC, and hence your reports are extracted whenever during forensics or during an incident correlation in UTC. Does an organization have a runbook defined that when you extract the report out of the EDR, you need to do UTC plus so many hours and then do a correlation report? Otherwise, you're going to only get garbage out of it. So those aspects, it's not only about the technology configuration or the NTP as a concept, but also the processes lying around. That's why everything we talk about in security is people, process, technology as an aspect, which people need to factor in. Otherwise, you are just kind of doing tick box kind of configuration requirements just for compliance sake.
Sure, thanks a lot for all these inputs actually, and definitely we'll open the session for the questions actually later on. But from here I'm picking up, because say we have logs, and if it is not in sync, it is tough to correlate. If it is happening at the organization level, still the ramification can be limited. But if you see from the national perspective, that ramification can be extensive actually. And probably that's the intent behind CERT's direction, what we can see. See, the challenges in terms of synchronization at organization level, we have seen so many diverse set of infrastructure. We have diversity in terms of geography and everything. Now, from national perspective, we see, and particularly if we see CERT or any regulator, when they are correlating, to get that kind of insight, what different organizations are sharing. If it is all on different connected with a different NTP server, it's going to be next to impossible to correlate and generate some sort of insight and share it back to the industry. And we are seeing this is the perspective from which CERT is coming in and sharing this direction and asking everyone to synchronize. On from that perspective, uh, what kind of insights which we can generate, probably if we can look at that perspective, that would also be good from the ecosystem perspective to understand like what kind of insights say CERT or any regulator can generate at a national level, which can help us. Any thoughts around that?
So I think just like we use a concept for NTP for our SIM, which has been age long for us. And in fact, NTP is not been coming out of requirements only from our certain directions. It's been there right from the IT Act itself also. Where in IT Act itself it was required that you have to have preserved logs available which can be traceable back to the incident. Hence NTP is by not very explicitly called out, but it's already implied in that requirement. Now, when you look at it from moving beyond the organization, now moving to the industry level or to the national level, CERT definitely has a very valid point when they've asked for the time synchronization as well as the preservation of logs, because we are looking at protecting only the organization. But in this country, there are so many organizations, there are so many entities, so many users who all also need protection in similar manner. And they need threat intel in a similar manner to understand whether an attack like a Log4j or a SolarWinds that really happened, and how can they protect against it by getting the IOC and IOA in time with the right sequence of events that can really happen in such an event, to be able to catch them as part of your ML engine and then act on it. Now, let's say there's an attack that happened at a certain organization in a hydrocarbon industry, and suddenly a similar attack happened in another hydrocarbon industry also, and they both have reported research saying that this is the timeline they are seeing, this is the IOC they are seeing. Automatically, this qualifies for CERT to pick up those IOCs, consolidate them, and pick it up and send it to the entire hydrocarbon industry, saying that this is what we are seeing as two incidents that happen in a similar pattern in the hydrocarbon industry. You guys have to look out for it. And that content automatically becomes a preventive mechanism now for the rest of the industry. Similarly, that if you see IOC which are happening cross industries, like Log4j was not limited to a certain industry itself. So if you saw it across industry and you're seeing it, then you have to have CERT have that IOC IOA published to almost all the organizations across the country, that this can happen to anybody, and hence you need to look at it at all your organizations across.
Sure. So overall, to build more, say we used to talk about AISS, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Now I think this, and CERT, if you see, CERT is sharing a lot of advisories to all the industries, industry verticals and industry members. If we see one aspect here is definitely, as he said, not everybody is at that level, and especially if we see MSMEs, small and medium scale, they might not be that ready with that, especially. And such kind of intel going back to them probably help them understand the things and be proactively taking actions to make them secure. So definitely, Faisal and Prakash, any views on that?
I'll share a brief here, what Dilip highlighted very nicely. Critical infra. And this is where probably a regulator plays a very, very crucial role. If a certain power plant is attacked somewhere in the country, and just to come back to the NTP, right, thankfully we just have one time zone in India, not like US. They have multiple time zones to manage across different geographics and different servers. In India, we just have one. Now, a critical infra like a power plant is attacked, and if those syncs are properly done with a very accurate timestamp, regulators like certain will have that leverage. What Dilip highlighted very nicely is to update and flag to others also, which is super critical. You don't want a situation where 6 to 7 power plants are attacked across the countries and most of the metros are in dark. Rather, from one just intel with a proper time stamping and obviously the IOCs and IOAs, you get to update others also, so that others get saved or get alerted and they are always in the monitoring mode. So that's from the critical infra perspective, the direction what CERT is giving is amazing, very, very valuable, and that was something which has to be followed.
Sure. And
Yeah, I'd like to add one more perspective here. I think uh, the the relationship of sharing the right intel across the industries, across entities is very relevant, and we now understand how critical the time zone, the NTP time sync is relevant. But I would say I lead the security operations within my organization. So we see incidents happening, right? So when we talk about doing that correlation, having the relevance, it's not only about what happens within the organization. It's also about what are the different hops, the miles that the how the incident started, right? It could be our service provider as well. Maybe we have an internet service provider, or we have a partner wherein we have a service which could be an entry point or an exit point. So when we are doing investigations, we need to make sure, and Dilip mentioned this earlier, we have a playbook inside, but we also need to have a playbook with our ecosystem, which is our partners. So if we are investigating a case where an time relevancy for an organization like, let's say, which is doing that investigation, also needs to have a partnership with that service provider where the time sync is very, very critical and relevant. And that's where at a national scale, the NTP requirements for all of us to have, and it's very difficult obviously to have the same source, but we need to align to a standard. And we are talking about UTC here. We're talking about maintaining that UTC sync across our footprint of the assets we have. And it is not only for organizations, but for service providers who are providing services as well, so that we have synergy when investigations are required to happen at an organization or at a national scale. So I think that's very important.
sure. So another thing that I'll add, which is so it is automatic way of enabling the collaboration in the ecosystem. Probably, if I take in that way, because everybody is now sharing things to certain. When we are getting that intel, it's kind of collaboration that is happening to protect the whole cyberspace. From that perspective, we should also see that actually. Uh, Another angle here is definitely when you are looking at, say, in given geopolitical situation, targeted attacks are very common, right? And from that perspective, if your time clock is not in sync, it is very difficult or next to impossible to even assess that something is happening in a targeted way, and which is very critical. And even in the third direction, you'll find the targeted attack thing coming in out of 20 list. That is only feasible if your clocks are in sync and you are correlating everything and finding out something is happening which is suspicious from a certain geography, certain targeted group, or some certain elements, right? That's only feasible if that NTP is in sync. So now coming to that direction, and I know many of you would be interested to listen from speakers, some best practices, some suggestions when you are trying to comply with this direction. How are you doing? And keep it their expert advice, not just connected with the organization only. It is like individual advice. So your suggestions, how can they comply with the direction, synchronize the system clocks?
Yeah, I'll just mention a couple of points. What we have been doing so far, it's more about I mean, as an any entity, it's distributed architecture, right? So we make sure that we have central sources defined for each of those environments we run, and at that level, then we have the standard UTC sync happening across those distributed systems. And then also the interval of sync is very important, so that there is no time lag happening. If your sync is not periodic, it will actually have an offset in a certain period of time. The last thing is governance. We are now focused off, and this is also coming in the directives also, we are focused to run a periodic governance on NTP sync as well. Initially, from a management perspective, I think it was not seen to be critical. We might have focused attention on assets that are critical in the organization, but we always kept the other systems not important for that particular governance coverage. But I would say governance is key here, making sure that at relevant periodic intervals, we are making sure that the time sync validation is happening, and we make sure that we don't lose the lag perspective in that validation.
I shared brief earlier also. Just ensure your images are clear. That's where you deploy, right? When DevOps team are in a hurry to deploy servers, and you will see 100 Kubernetes servers or clusters coming up in no time, you need to have those Docker registries defined properly, assuming most of the companies are on container infra now, moving away from the VDIs and the servers. So having your core infra as soon as it is deployed, or rather before it is deployed, all the settings are configured properly so that once it's deployed, you don't have to do another action on 1,000 servers again just to ensure you are in compliance to the regulator. That's the easy one.
I'll just elaborate more on what Faisal just touched upon. So when you're looking at NTP, it's just like any other solution or any other architecture design. Right from the design phase and implementation phase, you're taking care of those most of the times. But how to continuously operate is where we forget. Like we go and configure the NTP on systems, but we do not have a process as part of our standard hardening baseline review on a 6-monthly or a quarterly basis to validate whether the NTP is in sync or no. We deploy log sources across. We've not checked whether the log sources are periodically checked for whether the log sources having a timestamp in sync or no, by running some pen test samples, for example, and seeing whether logs which are getting triggered are all showing in sync within the time zone. Similarly, we don't have runbooks which are defined very clearly enough across our IR playbooks that we keep today, counting that which systems are on which time zone related log sources. Are they UTC? Are they UTC plus 530? Are they UTC plus 1130? Whatever they are configured for. Those aspects have to be all considered, because when shit hits the fan, when you have an incident that time, unless you have them documented, your incident response team, which is like the core team just focused upon isolation and recovery and remediation, they would not have these things coming to their mind that they have to look at, okay, plus 530 and stuff like that at that point. It has to be built in your playbook, has to be recorded over there in the steps that you follow as part of your recovery response program, and accordingly acted upon. And lastly, you need to have some kind of, just like you do breach assessment for simulations, you need to also have time synchronized simulations done to ensure that your logs which you get triggered on your SIEM or your source which they act upon, are they being worked in the right fashion with regards to your time zones. Because sometimes attackers do misuse the power of NTP and try to slow down your NTP clocks on certain systems to avoid a correlation happening on your SIM from the perspective of the same time stamps. The moment the timestamps are changing, they all fall as individual low sync or low severity events, and hence go under the radar. And the attacker is able to actually go about their entire plan the way they want to execute it. So those are some aspects I would say. Keep security simple, keep it practical. Ensure that you have the foundations covered and not just technology or solutions or architectures.
Sure, thanks a lot. So, couple of things that I'll pick here, and probably then we can open the floor for the question answer. So, one is, say, when you are leveraging, say, cloud or such kind of infrastructure, you need to make sure that which clock you want to synchronize with, especially in case of SaaS, as speakers have highlighted, right? Something of the similar nature in case of isolated systems, OT, IoT kind of infrastructure, which is not connected with the internet. But time synchronization is very critical for that infrastructure as well, which is isolated. These things can go wrong there as well. And if it is, say, SCADA system or critical infrastructure, isolated one, this can have a very large ramification. May not just limited to your organizations, may go beyond that. Another aspect here is, as we have heard, your governance should be very sacrosanct over there. You need to have your playbook ready. Couple of things which I tried highlighting. So like NTP can be used to attack as well. NTP has gone through a lot of evolution with time. It started way back in mid of 80s till now. Lot of evolution when we have seen certain sort of challenges, attacks and all those things. When we have seen this DDoS kind of attacks leveraging NTP, people have started blocking, if I remember it correctly, it was get monlist command. They have started stopping that thing. They have, if you are using some previous version of NTP servers and all, so try to keep monitoring the spikes coming in from the NTP request, because that can be a probable attack. So those kind of monitoring should be part of your governance systems. You keep tracking those things. Then it comes to, if you are not leveraging at all, so I think it works on port UDP port 123. So keep it blocked. Those kind of easy to do things you can keep it in place. But with that, definitely strong governance, your playbook should be ready, and all those measures should be there. Another aspect I'll add here is mostly, and when before the session we were talking, so mostly what happens, people focus on crown jewels, right? Critical assets. Having time synchronization maintained for certain assets, but in past we have seen DDoS coming from CCTVs, right? We may not take it that seriously that time, but it can create lot of repercussions later on. So that's why if we are doing it, probably we should do it across the ICT infrastructure, so that everything is in sync. Any ping which is happening there, or any log which is getting created, we can correlate and find out if something is suspicious, something is not going in the right direction. So with that, probably I'll open the floor for the question answers. If you have any questions, please.
Maybe a topic very close to me and Prakash's heart also. You touched upon a very critical area where IoT or OT systems using end-of-life operating systems, hardware, and so-called, even if it's a myth, it's still a myth, air-gapped systems. So what do you think the most challenges that you have come across, and what can be the most strategic approach to resolve them? I mean, for the benefit of the audience, in case if you can share your experience, the challenge and the approach.
Okay, so I'll just repeat your question. What are the challenges for IoT or OT systems, right? So like I said, I was fortunately working with a company which was very heavy on IoT. Fortunately making aircraft engines, huge power plants, huge windmills. Now power plants, if you per se, these are large devices spread across multiple kilometers, supplying a city to the probably half of the state or the whole city. Air gapping used to be the concept. It's no longer there. Most power plant operators, or for that matter, I have worked very heavily with Boeing and Airbus in my previous exposure. Now airlines need live data of an aircraft, right? I'm not sure in this room how many people have observed it. Whenever a plane lands at the airport, comes to the parking bay, when you are getting down, there's always a person who comes at the front tire of the plane and connects a cable. Right, I've gone through that whole thing. Now probably not many people are aware, but planes have firewalls, right? There is an entertainment system. You have onboard Wi-Fi. People watch FIFA matches on the plane, 30,000 feet in the air, international flights. This is the reality. So having air gap only is probably, the days are gone. The operators, be it a windmill operator or a power plant operator or even airlines, want their data live. Now to ensure that, obviously there needs to be IoT, OT infra protection mechanisms. There's no here that my plant will be air gapped only. Those days are gone. Your customers want live data on a live platform. How much power plant is generating, boiler, temperature, everything has to be live to be seen. So the best approach is not to say no to the older technology. Obviously, platforms like nuclear, it has to be air gapped. You can't connect on internet for sure. But technologies where IT OT devices can be connected, probably be protected with the IT OT firewalls and the infra, which will protect them better. A typical TCP/IP Cisco firewalls may not work. The dedicated OT firewalls available, which detects the protocols like Modbus and CAN bus and all, and that is the approach what one can take. Okay, that's a tough one. Okay, so I'll just repeat the question for others also. What is the approach for end-of-life operating system, right? Consider a power plant or a system where, in fact, understood. The approach what I have seen, I wouldn't say a best practice, but is to maintain a time sync server within the company, within the air-gapped infra. And as and when time permits, you allow internet connection to that. So if I have 100 devices within my power plant, all 100 connect to an internal time sync NTP server within the power plant, and only that server is exposed to the main device, right? Jump server. Yeah. There's no best answer to it actually. Multiple options. Yeah, but be as safe as possible.
I'll just add to what just Prakash said, and that's a major question which is coming in around the third direction. Actually, how will we do that? One proposition was that, and again, you are talking about very sensitive infrastructure. The sensitivity also varies, right? So what we were of the thought is, based on the risk rating of that particular asset, you can define a frequency, and during with that frequency, you keep synchronizing with the NTP server. Again, as a jump or whatever is the format, but have that risk rating done for that particular asset, have it recorded. Again, as you have Dilip said, your rule book should be there actually, playbook should be there actually, and risk rating is there. Based on that, this is my frequency, and keep doing it. So that probably would help you maintain those challenges what can come up. Any further question? So I think we can close the session here. Any last remarks from your side? Okay, that's awesome. So we have already done it. And thanks for Dilip, Prakash, and Fazul for joining us for this session. And thank you, audience, for coming for this just after the lunch.
Thank you everyone. Thank you for joining us.